In Memoriam by Ewart Allen McIntosh, May 1916. So you were David's father, and he was your only son, and the new-cut peats are rotting, and the work is left undone, because of an old man weeping, just an old man in pain, for David, his son David, that will not come again. Oh, the letters he wrote you, and I can see them still, not a word of the fighting, but just the sheep on the hill, and how you should get the crops in, ere the year gets stormier, and the Boches have got his body, and I was his officer. You were only David's father, but I had 50 sons, when we went up in the evening, under the arch of the guns. And we came back at twilight. O God, I heard them call to me for help and pity, but could not help at all. Oh, never will I forget you, my men that trusted me, more my sons than your father's, for they could only see the little helpless babies and the young men in their pride. They could not see you dying, and hold you while you died. Happy and young and gallant they saw their firstborn go, but not the strong limbs broken, and the beautiful men brought low. The piteous writhing bodies, they screamed, "Don't leave me, sir," for they were only your fathers, but I was your officer. Hello, and welcome to No Extra Words, the Flash Fiction Podcast. My name is Chris Baker-Dersch. I'm your producer and editor. Everything about this episode is a bit different than the way we usually do it. The story selection is different. The sound effects are different. The commentary has really detailed notes because I have a lot to say today, and there's some things I want to do with this episode, and I've recorded this a million times and keep missing things. So when I put together the production calendar over the summer and realized that one of our release days was going to be November 11th, I immediately knew that I wanted to do an Armistice Day episode and honor this holiday in its historical context. Armistice Day goes back to 1918, and it has evolved a lot since then. In the U.S., where I live, it is now Veterans Day. My going back to the original name and historical context is not meant to diminish the need to celebrate and honor veterans. If that is what you are doing today, I tip my cap to you. Having said that, I think Americans tend to view history from our own perspective, and we think of World War I as starting in 1917 and being this historical blip. I hear friends complain about how this particular holiday doesn't live on a Monday like every other holiday. It breaks up their work week. And I roll my eyes a little bit, because I think about that 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month for a generation that had lived through 4 years of grueling war with losses that are completely mind-boggling. I mean, if you read the number of casualties per day, per month in some of these battles, your brain can't understand those numbers. They're too big. And what's even worse is it's for nothing. Nothing gained, nothing changed, nothing. These battles are so futile. And if you've just survived 4 years of that, and everybody finally puts their guns down, yeah, that's the moment that you're going to celebrate. And it's a big deal. I'm something of a World War I history nerd, in case you can't tell. But this isn't a historical podcast, so we aren't going to go into all that. If you want a historical podcast, you got to go get Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. He has a 6-part series on World War I that is incredibly long. It'll take you like 20 hours to get through it. It's super detailed and utterly fascinating. This is a literary podcast. Actually, it's a short story podcast, but I broke the rules because I started us off with a poem, which I don't do. But I couldn't do Armistice Day without including a work by one of what the Brits simply call the war poets. I went to London a few years ago and wanted to stand in Westminster Abbey and wanted to stand in Poets' Corner, stand with Chaucer and Dickens and Lewis Carroll and be there with the ghosts of literary past. And I did that, and it's very powerful. Westminster Abbey is cool no matter what you're into, but for a literary person, standing in Poets' Corner is an amazing experience. And then I turned and I saw the graves of the war poets. If you ever do that, look at the dates. Some of those guys did not live through the war. Some of them did. But regardless, the time period in which they were writing, they were so young. they were 20, 22, 24. I know a lot of you out there are writers. Imagine being in this moment where it's your words that define things for a generation. I mean, what greater honor could a writer ask for? This is not a poetry podcast, but I read a super depressing statistic a few years ago that more people write poetry in America than read it, which the librarian in me just wanted to blow my brains out. But sometimes, and this is coming from somebody who edits a short story podcast and writes short stories, sometimes the world needs a poem. Sometimes a poem says what a story can't say. Sometimes a poem says what nothing can say. And so I gave you guys a poem today. I read somewhere that World War I is the war of poetry, because it happened at this unique time in history when your literacy levels are high and you have a lot of free press, especially in Britain, so the words can get to the people. But it's before the picture takes over. It's before that visual imagery takes over. There's no moving footage of World War I at all. It didn't exist back then. Or at least not in a way that they could get it and capture it on a battlefield. In World War in World War II, you've got the newsreels and the radio broadcasts, and it's very visual, what you see of it. It was a very different kind of war coverage. In World War I, you have an occasional picture, but to a large extent, you've got the words. And it's the poets and the reporters that really made people understand what was going on out there. And so those war poets are so important. There's a great backstory to this poem. It's sad, but talks about the poet and the moment this poem was written, who it was written in honor of, and it's in the show notes, noextrawords.wordpress.com if you're curious and would like to know more. And there's more war poetry that you can access there as well, or go to the library and get a book of it. Seriously, if you ever want to feel grateful for what you have and take a moment to reflect, get a book of British war poetry from the First World War and sit with it and watch the evolution of those words from 1914, when it's all patriotic and glory and guns and we're gonna go save the world, to what happens after 2 years of mud and trenches and needless death. And it's a truly amazing time for poetry. Again, we're a short story podcast, so we are going to feature a short story today. And it is an odd choice for our Armistice Day episode. I didn't know what I was looking for when I started to put together an Armistice Day episode. And when I first read Peter on the Island, Pan is Dead by Adam McGomber, I didn't think that was going to be it. I wanted to bring it to you. I didn't think it was going to be on Armistice Day. However, I started thinking about armistice, that word, and what it is. It's a ceasefire. It's a coming of the peace. That's really what it's about. It's about the moment you put the weapons down and the moment that you kind of realize war isn't helping you anymore. And Peter on the Island, Pan is Dead is an ancient story about the ancient god Pan that Adam McGomber takes in a direction I had never seen it go before. And it really is a big story about big ideas, about futility and love, and it took me to a mental and emotional place that I needed to be today. And so I'm going to share it with you. And I would love to hear if you think it's a terrible fit for this episode, if you loved it, but thought the rest of the Armistice Day episode didn't fit at all, or if you thought it all meshed. I would love to hear what you have to say, because I can see how it could go a lot of different ways. But I am going to bring it to you. And I'm going to finish this episode with 2 minutes of silence. This is traditional in a lot of countries that celebrate Remembrance Day, Armistice Day, whatever it is you're celebrating today. Traditionally, the first minute is to remember the dead, the war dead. The second minute is to remember the living. So that's the wives and the children and the comrades. That's where the veterans part comes in, the survivors, the people who came home, who also need our thoughts. So whether you're hearing this on Armistice Day, I'm recording it a couple weeks early, or whether you're hearing it some future date, I'm just going to sit here for 2 minutes. I'm going to turn my stopwatch on and leave my mic running, and just you'll get to hear the sound of me sitting here in the silence of my office. And I hope you'll sit with me and reflect and do something we don't get a chance to do often enough, which is really send our thoughts to the place they need to be. Commentary's been long today. We're going to get you to that story. I do appreciate you sticking with me. I do appreciate you being a part of today. I'm passionate about this episode. I know it's an odd mishmash, but thank you for being here. I am going to bring you a much more traditional 2-story episode of No Extra Words next week. I hope you'll tune in for that. May peace be in your thoughts today. Peter on the Island, or Pan is Dead, by Adam McGomber. Do not imagine me nymph, nor fay, nor ragged spirit of the air. I am a stranger body still. With well-worn hoof and claw-like hand, I am risen from antique depths. Picture me as I walked in the leafy shade of unspoiled Arcadia. Shadows of lush fir trees spilled over me like dark water. I carried a flute of tethered reeds. And there was always music, or at least the memory of it. I tripped from stone to stone, sometimes pausing to pick lice from the fur of my hindquarters. My mind was quiet, as it should have been, but from my heart there hung a kind of longing, a heavy, dripping nest. It was difficult to name all the creatures that inhabited it, and now I can only say that they have never left me still. I was old even then, in that long-ago forest, yet I have never been aged in appearance. I have the face of a charming youth, a brown-eyed boy, except, of course, my eyes are the color of goldenrod. They shine in the depths of the wood, and stony horns protrude from the skin of my brow. How many a handsome soldier have I frightened along a dusky path! I lusted after those soldiers, not merely for their spirits, but for their bodies, too. I longed for the smell of leather against flesh. I wanted to taste their full Roman lips, to stroke their hard white scars, and kiss their shoulders darkened by the sun. But I found the merest rumor of my presence sent them scurrying along the forest paths like boys running from the master's whip. The soldiers caught up with their companions. They told laughing stories around campfires. The beast of Parnon was lurking, the goat god of the wilderness. There was an earlier age, of course, more rustic and faith-filled, when I was worshipped. Priests once made sacrifices in my name. Pindar wrote that the virgins sang of me. They called me Baal and Tammuz. They wailed and struck their breasts. I never felt I deserved such worship. And in truth, the songs of virgins did not interest me. Instead of listening, I would climb the barren mountain-sides, and in darkness I'd teach the shepherds to touch themselves in nighttime fields. I instructed those youths how to touch one another, too. I remember the scent of the herdsmen, like apple blossom and wild iris. They made their peace amongst the broken pillars of long-dead civilizations. Afterward they lay in one another's arms, damp with sweat and clear of eye. And they whispered together. That sound was praise enough. But the shepherds on the hillside were my company long ago. And so the soldiers, too. Man was such a fool for a time, I learned. He even lost his gods. One morning there came an unexpected change. A sailor called Tamus, not a particularly bright or interesting boy, was on his way to Italy, and near the coast he heard what he believed to be a divine voice coming over the water. The voice said, "Pan is dead. Proclaim it. The great god Pan is dead." It was in the forest when I heard the echo of those words. I listened all day and into evening, hoping for some refute, but all was silent afterward, and I knew the incantation the curious voice had spoken was somehow true. Pan was dead, as was Baal and Tammuz, and even the beast of Parnon. I was left a nameless thing, forsaken, like so many before me. I retreated to an island then, a bleak outcropping in the sea. It was small enough to have no name, and was not shown on any map. Sea lilies grew from craggy rocks, and great storms sometimes welled, but I had no interest in such things. I hoped only that such a place might hold my grief. This tiny stone vessel, this empty never was. I told myself I must learn to feel at home on the island, for I too would never be again. I'd been made a phantom, a shadow. Pan was dead, and I was dead. I found a grotto. I slept in a cave near a pool of black water, and there I did not dream, nor did I think of man, for what was the point? Man certainly did not think of me. It went on like that, forever it seemed, and then one day, many years on, I heard a clamor upon the sea. There was shouting and cannon fire. I scuttled from my cave and perched upon a stone to watch two great ships do battle in the island's narrow cove. I saw fire. I saw the ocean itself turn black. And after a long while, when one ship had sunk and the other had sailed away, I slunk back to my cave, wondering whom the dying men might pray to. It was then, on the rocky rim of my home, that I saw a smear of blood. The blood smelled human, and my heart quickened. I peered into the darkness of my cave and discerned there a shape, a man hunched and shivering. I realized he must have been one of the sailors from the warring ships. He'd somehow dragged himself here from the sea. The man was handsome, dark, wearing a red coat with buttons made of gold. His black hair dripped with brine. The pale fingers of one hand trembled on his knee. I crawled toward him in the darkness, hoping not to frighten him. The sailor bled. He'd been wounded in battle. There was a deep cut on his cheek, and his left hand, I realized, was missing, hacked away, perhaps by the blade of a sword. Yellow bone protruded from the meat of his wrist. The young sailor opened his eyes when he heard my approach. The eyes were a lovely pellucid blue. It had been so long since I was close to a man, since I'd smelled a man's scent and listened to a man's breath. I thought of the soldiers in Arcadia and the shepherds on the hill. I was amazed the sailor did not recoil at the sight of my yellow eyes and horns. Instead, he smiled weakly. "Peter," he whispered there in the darkness of the cave. His lips were pale, drained of blood. "I'm so glad—" He trailed off. I said nothing, not wanting to break whatever spell kept this fragile specimen alive. "I'm sorry," the sailor said. He winced in pain. "I've wanted to tell you." I believed for a brief moment that this bleeding sailor in his red jacket might be ghost of the other sailor, Thamus, who had long ago proclaimed my death. Thamus had come to apologize. Then the sailor spoke again. "My love," he said, "you called me James. I said you were mad. Remember the river Eton, the place we used to go. You must—" I looked into the sailor's eyes, which gazed not at me, but at some long-ago moment. "I pretended," he said. "I pretended you did not exist. Come closer, Peter." I crouched nearer him. "Will you touch my cheek, old friend?" he said. I touched him ever so gently with the claw of my hand. James then raised his bleeding stump. It appeared as though he thought he was stroking me with his missing hand. "The ship came upon us so swiftly," he said. "Just off the coast. I think I might be blind now. And my hand. Can you see it?" "I see it," I lied, gazing at the yellow bone emerging from his wrist. He smiled again. There was blood on his teeth. "So strange this," he said. "I dreamed of you last night, Peter. We were boys again, as we were at Eton. But now we were together, on board the ship, my ship, the Roger. Only it did not sail upon the waters. It flew. We sailed together through the clouds. I held you and watched a flock of birds move around us like a school of porpoises. And when the night fell, it was as though we glided amongst the lamps of the stars." I touched the sailor's cheek once more. He was growing cold. I realized that in all my ages I had never watched a man die before. "I wish you would kiss me now," James said, "as you once did by the river Eton. I'll close my eyes. I'll think of flying." I leaned forward to kiss the sailor, but before my lips touched his I paused. Why I did this I cannot say, for wasn't this what I'd wanted? Wasn't this what I'd needed for so many years? Yet to have it now, on this island, with a dying man. It was in that pause that the sailor's lids fluttered, and his eyes briefly focused. His expression changed. A flicker of fear passed over his features. He saw me for what I was, not Peter, but the goat, the pen. The sailor's phantom hand fell away. His breath grew still, and I thought, somewhere in the distance, I could hear the divine voice speaking once again, taking what it was not meant to take, telling stories it was not meant to tell. I reached up and closed the dead sailor's eyes. Then I kissed him gently on his lips. I sent him off into the sky like that, as I thought this Peter might have done.